This is another programme in our series Unbinding Our Stories, and this time we hear three women share their accounts of the abuse they suffered. Anne gave evidence as a survivor to the United Kingdom independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. Here Anne, which isn't her real name, discloses the grooming and abuse she suffered from a trusted family, friend and priest, and the abuse she then faced at the hands of the Catholic Church when she reported it. And then, in a recording made by the American support group Awake Milwaukee, Kathy Coll and Gigi Fontanilla answer the question what I want Catholics to understand about clerical abuse, and their searing honesty is not something you'll want to miss.
Coming to you now, you're known as A711 because that was the number you were given when giving your evidence to the abuse inquiry. Could you just tell us a little bit about the importance for you today of not appearing on camera and why you've chosen to do that?
I think there's a variety of reasons. I think I'm still at the stage where I feel it's very important to talk about my experience, particularly about the church's reaction to my experience when I came forward to report the historic abuse. But I suppose at the same time, I do have a life that I don't necessarily want this story to be part of. And the people that I do want to know my story know it, and that's what I feel comfortable with.
I think that's absolutely a survivor's right, isn't it? That they choose who they tell their story to and when they tell it. There was a dangerous moment, I think, in the O'Brien story where it felt almost as if the people telling their stories became public property, or it was expected that they should be public property. And I think we really have to look carefully at that. So, Anne, bearing in mind that there will be parameters to what you want to tell us today about what happened to you, could we maybe just set a little bit of the context, the background of your story? Could you tell us, first of all, just about your background, about your family, and about the place that church played in your upbringing?
Yeah, so church was very important to me growing up as a child and as a teenager. And I was very involved in the local parish, in the youth group. My friends, my social life were around the church. And I think then at the age of 15, life changed forever. A very charismatic priest who was in his late 30s began to work his way into my circle of friends, a group of teenagers meeting in our local parish. And I think it would be true to say that we were quite in awe of this man. He seemed very spiritual. The masses, he said, were wonderful. All of us were keen to spend time with him without us realising his motivation about why he wanted to spend time with us. And I think, in stories that this is very typical of, there was a whole grooming process when I look back on those years from 15 onwards. Began by going to confession to him, thinking that this was really important. He was encouraging me to go to confession face to face in the priory where he lived, not in church. And I thought, oh, gosh, this is amazing. He wants to get to know me. He's interested. I could share my problems. And then it progressed to being invited to go swimming with him. And that's where the abuse began, and he progressed things in such a way that I think really he had groomed my family. My parents were very impressed with him. I think he probably groomed the community, the group of friends that I was with. And by the time I was 16, the abuse had become more serious, and this continued through to when I was 18. I went off to university, thought this was an opportunity to you know, kind of escape what was happening. But he offered lift to my parents and offered to take me to university, bring me back home. And it seemed as though it was really difficult to assert myself by then and extricate myself from what was happening. And that abuse continued into my early 20s, and was, well, just became, I suppose, this hidden life that he controlled. So I thought Root and Branch's title, Stolen Lives, was such a good title. It really made me reflect on how from that time of 15 onwards, how my life was gradually stolen and taken and controlled.
I think we'll be looking later on in the session at that very important point, Anne, about the kind of lifelong effects of abuse. But I think you've raised such an important part of the whole abuse story, and that's this idea of grooming. And you've mentioned that your abuser was a very charismatic figure, and I think that's something that we'll also talk about in Brian's story. But the idea of grooming, and we saw this, we've seen it in lots of different abuse stories around the world, particularly in places like Boston, where groups of priests actually targeted vulnerable families, single parent families, where they offered to help with putting the children to bed and praying with them and so on, because there was no father figure. And there's a very, very dangerous manipulation that goes on there. I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about how much you think your abuser was deliberately cultivating your family, manipulating the situation. Do you, if you look back as an adult, see in the childhood and the reason why he picked you?
I don't. That's a really difficult question, isn't it? Why did he pick me? Picked me perhaps because I was available, I was responding to his attention. I had this faith that he could use as a kind of hook, if you like, at the beginning to kind of hook me in. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the manipulation was absolutely considered, and very much he knew what he was doing. And typical of the grooming process, he was prepared to bide his time. He was prepared to, you know, incrementally kind of up his game, if you like. So yes, when I look back, I can definitely see how that progressed and how that was done very purposely by him. Yes.
As a young girl, you must have been very confused about your relationship with this man. You're a teenager, you're a 15-year-old girl. I imagine you have the same ideas of romance as, you know, most 15-year-old girls. Did you have a sense of confusion about what this relationship was and what it represented?
I was very, very confused, and I think what made it even more confusing was that when the abuse first began, it was never spoken about by him. There was this silence, and there was also this kind of unspoken idea that I shouldn't speak about it either. So it wasn't acknowledged by him, and he didn't acknowledge what he was doing until much later down the line, by which time I was already being controlled by him.
There's a whole dynamic of silence and control that takes place in abuse. And I think there's a very important area that I'd like to ask you about. And I want to make clear before I ask the question that there is no sense, am I asking you to justify anything here? But I would like you to try and explain to people who say, well, why did you not report this? Why did you not, refuse to be in his company? Why did you not tell your parents? And that is such a difficult and complex question. But can you explain to people what goes on that makes you unable to talk about this abuse?
I think the dynamics of abuse are centered around power and control. And in this case, this was someone years older, old enough to be my father. This was someone who was not only very charismatic, but very prominent in his religious order. He had a very prominent leadership role in the order. And at 15 years old, and to find even the words to get your head around what was happening just seemed impossible. And because of that silencing and because of not speaking out, then he was able to take the control. And for me to find myself then living this other life that was hidden from my parents, that I had not been able to speak about with them, it's as though you are kind of ensnared or trapped in this mesh of dynamics that it's impossible to extricate yourself from. And I think, the most perhaps powerful part of, or most awful part of this experience is that when I did eventually find the courage and the strength to say to him, I want nothing to, this was now in my early 20s, so I want nothing to do with this, I want to get out of this, that his response was to turn up to my flat and to rape me. And at that point, all effort, that massive effort to extricate myself from this abusive relationship was completely destroyed.
Were you frightened of this man, Anne?
At times I was frightened. I mean, again, it's very, very complicated dynamics that are in that relationship. At times what frightened me, I think, most was that I couldn't get rid of him.
Yeah. Well, actually, that in a way leads on to the next part of your story, because I think if people want to understand the kind of true power dynamic of abuse, they'll learn a lot from the way that you actually escaped from this man, because you entered a convent, didn't you?
I did in my early 20s. I joined a religious order, and I thought for me, there are lots of different reasons, but I think for part of it, it was kind of an escape. And it was when, in that religious order, his access to me was so much more difficult, not practical. And I spent several years, 9 years in the religious order, taking that time really to work out, actually, that wasn't the place for me. But also during that period of time, becoming quite ill and very, very luckily, being able to access psychotherapy on the NHS for 4.5 to 5 years, and that's what really saved me. And at the end of that period of time, to have discovered a sense of autonomy and a sense of personhood that enabled me to move on.
I think that's a really interesting way of describing it, that you discovered a sense of personhood. I think in the past you said to me something about you discovered your adult self, and that is a really important distinction. Can you explain a little bit to people about, they might think, well, you were in your 20s and 30s, of course you were an adult, but what do you mean by that? You discovered your adult self?
I think what I discovered was that I did have a part of me that was an adult and that could look after myself and could look after that child. The child that hadn't been looked after, that had been abused, that through the psychotherapy I was able to realise that perhaps I did have the wherewithal and capacity to look after that part of myself because I was an adult.
You had a period of stability after this kind of course of therapy where you felt reasonably happy in your life until I think the death of your mum in 2015, was it?
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, did you ever tell your parents about what had happened? Did you?
So I did want to. I did an attempt in my 30s when I was not well and in psychotherapy. I did actually write a letter to my parents to say I wasn't well and to explain, why I wasn't well. And I think it was too much for them to be able to cope with that information. So my mum was very concerned that I wasn't well, but she never spoke to me about the reason why I wasn't well. That's been quite a difficult thing for me, but I suppose it shows the extent to which this priest had groomed people so well, that she didn't feel able to speak about the abuse with me. So you're right. When she died in 2015, my grief for her, my grieving for her, within that raised also issues about what my relationship with her hadn't been able to be because of what had happened at the age of 15 onwards. And that provoked kind of flashbacks, memories of the abuse. And I knew at that stage that I had to look for some sort of healing and closure, and that it was right for me to come forward and to report the historic abuse to the church.
Well, I think at this point, this turn in your story where you go to report to the church is where it's almost like being re-abused again, and isn't it, where you go to the church with your story. And I wonder, what were you hoping for as somebody who'd given 9 years in a convent to the church? I imagine that you must have felt something of an insider and that they would listen to what you had to say.
Well, unfortunately, when I went to the church to report the abuse, I think I was probably in for the greatest shock then of all of my experiences in some ways, because you're right, I belonged to the church. I felt I was a member of the church, and I went to the church, I think, looking for support, looking for an acknowledgement, if you like, that the church would be part of my healing. And unfortunately, that couldn't have been further from the truth. The reception, I think, of my coming forward to report the abuse, I'm not saying that the church didn't take action, because they did. The priest was removed from ministry, but the process then of sharing information with me, of meeting with me, became one enormous uphill battle. And I felt as though I was an outsider almost from day one, that I was an outsider. I was the other, and the tables just seemed to have turned, and this church that I belonged to and actually, given my professional life to as well, was not the church that I knew or recognised.
I think as soon as you challenge in the Catholic Church, you become an outsider, and that's the difficulty, isn't it? Because you're also isolated. So you feel eventually, many of the abuse survivors that I've spoken to eventually feel like they're the problem. It's all about them, and they are in some way flawed, and that's why nobody's listening to them or taking them seriously. And I imagine that your self-esteem takes a real battering in that process, Anne.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt probably at my lowest because of my dealings with the Diocese of Westminster, who were overseeing my case. And I think what was particularly worrying, I mean, people might be aware from media coverage, you know, that the diocese had portrayed me in emails as some manipulative, needy woman who tried to bully safeguarding staff, and basically I wasn't someone to engage with because you wouldn't be able to get rid of me. And this awful picture that was painted of me that I didn't recognise, nobody who knew me recognised. And this picture had been put together by people in the diocese who had not even met me. Some hadn't even spoken to me. In fact, most of them hadn't even spoken to me, but had built up this picture, which is typical, I think, in the church of this victim blaming culture. So, yes. you know, the blame is on the victim and the survivor, and we're seen at best as nuisances, at worst manipulative. And I was absolutely shaken to the core, really, to see that that's what the church thought of me.
I mean, we could actually spend a full hour talking about, you know, that whole process of going to the church. So, you know, because of the limits of time, let's kind of reduce this a little bit to the basics. You had this long battle with the church to listen to you. Eventually, they settled out of court. You then put in this request to find all the correspondence about you, and you discover all these things that have been said about you, which would really dent anybody reading that stuff about themselves, where you're told you're manipulative and needy. And I think there was one where somebody said that they would just continue to play the good practice card, a really awful phrase, which we'll come back to later in the session. Yeah. But at that point, what happens? Your lawyer said that it was a unique case, that you're taking the church back to court. You've already settled with them over the abuse itself. You go back because of the distress caused by reading this email communication. Again, they settle out of court. Do you believe that was deliberate so that they didn't set a legal precedence with this case? Are they that clever in their legal dealings?
I think they are that clever. I think you know what I think all survivors know in our experience of the church is how much lawyers and insurers are behind decisions that are made, decisions that should be made on pastoral grounds but are made by lawyers and insurers to protect the reputation of the church and to protect their assets. Yes. And interestingly, when they did settle out of court, and this was because I had felt so, I suppose, such a need for justice when, after the public inquiry and Cardinal Nichols, was highlighted for his lack of compassion and putting the reputation of the church before survivors, and he didn't step down. And I thought, there's got to be some accountability somewhere for how the church is treating survivors with this cruel indifference that was cited in the French report more recently. And that's why really I kind of took the case against Westminster to highlight in the public arena that there is no accountability, and the church thinks that if we don't speak up about it, it can just continue. And so I hoped that my case would would highlight the way in which survivors have been re-traumatized when they come forward to the church.
One of the real difficulties, Anne, I think, is that, people don't necessarily know what's going on, because at the moment the church are talking a good game. They're using that good practice card to suggest that things have transformed, that they're handling things differently, when behind the scenes they're handling them in many cases in exactly the same way as they did before. So events like this, which publicise exactly what's happening, are so important. And I want to thank you for taking us through that first part of your story.
When one is broken, the body suffers. Let's pray for healing for one another. When one is broken, the body suffers. Let's pray for healing for one another. Let's pray.
I am so delighted to introduce my friend Kathy Coll, who is a retired teacher and an active Catholic in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. Since Kathy's experience of assault by a Catholic priest in 2016, she has made it her mission to support other women who have experienced abuse by founding the SMG Catholic Women Support Network. Kathy is also a new member of our Courageous Conversations planning team, and her smile always lights up a room, even on Zoom. So Kathy, we're so glad to have you here tonight. I'm wondering, what do you want Catholics to understand about abuse in the church?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to all of you that are here today to listen. This means an awful lot to me, and I'm sure the other survivors. Well, for me, I want Catholics to understand that adults can be abused also. My life changed drastically on Sunday, December 11th in 2016. I was in my home. I was raped by a priest from Nigeria who was serving in my parish and attending a prestigious university for his doctorate degree in counseling. I was 65 years old at the time, and I was totally in shock that this priest would do this to me. My life had been spent in service of church and a God who I loved with all my heart. And that day, the thing that basically became part of my thinking was, this is my priest. It was just like a recording over and over in my head. Why would he do something like this to me? How could he? He's a sacred man of God. Well, my life became a crazy world of doctors and therapists and nightmares and depression and anxiety attacks. And so many more things, all that were identified as part of my PTSD. As an adult in this church world of cover-ups and distrust and pain and denial, I was really in turmoil because my roots were always of prayer, helping others, as evidenced by the many ministries that I was involved in, by healthy relationships that I had with clergy and staff, and my unending love of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. When I went to the diocese and asked for help, I asked for some type of a group that I could become a part of people who had experienced the same type of abuse. But my diocese had nothing, no prayer group, no support group. And then to top it all off, my request to have my perpetrator sent home, well, that was denied too. So my life became one of study, policy, and history of the church regarding pastoral conduct. To me, it was very, very important to understand why I was in this position, why my life with God became stronger and stronger. I began to really look as I was healing. I was involved at that time with helping parishioners get clearances. So I knew about the code of conduct that was published in 2017, where my bishop proclaimed the following. He said, he will protect everyone. And he identified children, he identified church personnel, and he even identified vulnerable adults. And I'll define that as people who have some type of a compromised physical or mental incapacity where they can't make decisions on their own. And he promised to protect them out of situations that led him to lead these people to harm. Well, that didn't cover me, nor my needs as a rape victim. Well, as I continued on, in the wake of the Pennsylvania grand jury report on child sexual abuse by Catholic clergy in 2018, my bishop again stepped forward, and I looked to him to hear as he established it was more or less a 5-point system. And now he vowed to protect children, youth, again, vulnerable adults, and then victims of priest abuse when they were young. And I don't hold anything against that, but nowhere did I see the words an adult woman or man. We're here. I'm here. There's other women of clergy abuse that are here. Why aren't we being recognized? Did I miss something? It just adds additional layers of so many layers of hurt. And, why are they trying to minimize things that happened to me? So as a result, the silence of my church has allowed my perpetrator to graduate with a doctorate in psychiatry, live in my city, and not be sent home. And I have no idea to this day where he is. I will say lots of work has gone into my healing journey, and I continue every day to adjust my behavior from triggering events, actions that are occurring, and I feed my passion to use my voice for victims who are incapable of speaking yet. I am beginning to see the beauty of the world around me, which is important. I feel strength and determination to face the church that totally let me down through silence and betrayal. And finally, I know that God has given me grace and the ability to work in my community to enlighten people about abuse and my paths to healing. So for all of the abuse victims that are here tonight, may you find peace in justice that you so deserve.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you for sharing that story. And I wish the same for you.
Thank you, Sarah.
I'm wondering, given all the ways that you've not been recognized and not supported as someone who was assaulted as an adult, what gives you hope? I know you to be a very hopeful person. So what gives you hope in the midst of all of that?
Well, I really believe that as a survivor, I have a choice. I can be angry, be upset, all those emotions that we all talk about. Or I can find hope. You need hope to be able to climb that mountain. You need hope to be able to handle any type of adversity. And a friend of mine wrote a really wonderful book, and he talked about the keepers of hope. And one of the things that I decided is that I want to be a keeper of hope, because you can certainly have people that just don't get it, and you just have to get them to listen, and you have to get them to understand how important this is. So if I could ask anybody, try to be a keeper of hope, and that will help not only you, but the person that you're dealing with.
We're going to turn now to my friend Gigi Fontanilla, who lives in Florida and does important work for a nonprofit organization that serves the poor. Gigi is the survivor of abuse as an adult, and I have been really blessed to get to know her through Awake Survivor Circles, where her example of humility and faith is such a gift. I should also share that this is her first time speaking publicly about her abuse. So we are especially inspired by your courage, Gigi, in speaking here this evening. So, Gigi, what would you like Catholics to understand?
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I want Catholics to understand that healing has no timetable, and that each abuse survivor's story is unique and complex. Mine is no different. I was abused by a friend who I knew since the 8th grade. We are the same age, grew up in the same parish and town. His dad was in my dad's choir. His mom and me were friends. Waiting for so much time to come forward till now was not about protecting him as much as it was about protecting our mutual friends from having to choose between the both of us. But I think this platform is small enough where I feel comfortable enough to share. My abuser and I had a class in 9th grade and were acquaintances throughout high school. And then we went our separate ways after graduation. In 2009, he came back into my life. He was already a priest for several years when we reconnected. He sexually abused me December of 2010 for several months into 2011. Since it has been quite a while since my abuse, it is easier for me to speak openly about it. But as Sarah said, this is my first time speaking about it in a group setting. I honestly think it is not only a miracle that I'm still employed and still Catholic, it's a miracle I'm even alive, because the abuse affected my life in numerous and profound ways. I kind of feel like I reached rock bottom and there was no way of going except back up. I realized I was faced with two choices. It was either kill myself or learn to get better and heal from this. But there is no instruction manual, as there is no healing timetable of how to heal from clergy sexual abuse. It helped a great deal that another female friend of mine, who was also abused by the same priest, decided also to come forward. So there are two complaints about this one priest. I stayed Catholic and she did not. After making this difficult decision of staying in the church, I took a year off of active ministry in order to focus on my healing. I think it was a wise decision. It is weird, the thing that hurt me is what also helped me heal. I still went to daily mass and confession. Depression, though, is so difficult because you don't want to even get out of bed, let alone go anywhere else. So I think my guardian angels are the ones that carried me to mass and confession. I actually got spam email from my abuser's email address just 2 months ago. So I texted my friend, who was my canon lawyer at the time as my case was unfolding. And I said, I don't think it's actually from him, but what should I do about it? I know my friend means well, but he said, oh, just erase it, out of sight, out of mind. Those words he texted back, out of sight, out of mind, really struck me. And I texted him, okay, but if I really wanted to forget what happened to me and it be out of my mind, I would have to be reincarnated to a whole new human being, because I can never forget what happened to me. It is not my identity, but it is a part of my story, and it has changed me forever. I've worked hard to be gentle with myself and also love those parts of me that were affected by the abuse. Without a doubt, it has been challenging because I've not only chosen to stay Catholic, but I am an active Catholic. I still volunteer at my church, and my place of work is a nonprofit charity that employs retired Catholic priests. It's hard to believe next month, October 16th, is the 10-year anniversary of when I came forward to my diocese and made a complaint about this priest. It's been an unbelievable journey filled with so much pain, and I can't believe I'm even saying this, but also joy. This is probably the time I learned that God can bring goodness out of even the most horrific of circumstances. Not that God caused my abuse, but he used this as a catalyst for healing, for things that happened long before I was even abused by a priest. But that's another story for another time. There's so much more I could say, but before I conclude, I just wanted to take the time to thank you, Sarah, and the Awake team from the bottom of my heart for this opportunity and this safe space to process what happened to us and for others to hear our story. This is a place where we feel unconditionally loved, listened to, and our voice matters. Secondly, to the rest of you that are here, thank you for taking the time to come today and face this difficult decision head on. You have no idea how much this means to me. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you so much, Gigi. That was beautiful. And I know this is a really big deal for you. So thank you so much for your courage in speaking tonight. I just wanted to ask kind of one follow-up question. You talked about just how awful this has been for you, how hard it has been, and such a especially difficult period in reporting your abuse. I'm wondering what has been most helpful to you in healing over these years.
Sure. Well, there are two main, there's a lot of things, but I think the two main things that were really helpful was I had a really good spiritual director and also a good therapist. And actually, this one therapist I tried in the past had an old directory of our diocese. And she said, you really need to get in touch with the chancellor and report your abuse. Do you know a Monsignor so-and-so? And I'm like, of course I know him. He's my new pastor at my church. Except he wasn't the chancellor anymore, but he became my spiritual director in 2012 and is still my spiritual director today. I believe the Lord brought the former chancellor into my life, who's a kind and wonderful priest, because the new one I had to make the official complaint to caused me more heartache than the sexual abuse itself by his indifference and shutting me out when I had questions. So my spiritual director's kindness and consistency and getting back to me in a timely manner made up for a great deal of the anguish and sorrow I felt from the chancellor. So I don't think all that was coincidental, but I believe that was God's providence and his way of taking care of me. Thank you.